Hello, traveler of time. Welcome to Mild History, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Let the humid air of the Bengal Delta wrap softly around you. We are settling in, not on a great battlefield or inside a grand court, but in a place where history was made in the quiet, methodical counting of profit and the silent, chaotic flow of death. I'm grateful to have you here. Let this peaceful storytelling be the soft foundation for your rest. Tonight, we journey to a city that in the 19th century was known as the second city of the British Empire, Calcutta, now Kolkata. As the night deepens, listen closely to the sounds of this great, conflicted port. Can you hear the distant creak of the tall masts on the Hooghly River, the soft, muffled shouts of late-night dock workers, the rhythmic drone of insects in the tropical air? We will not dwell on Calcutta's invisible grandeur, but rather on its deep, quiet contradictions, the massive, visible flows of wealth and the silent, invisible flows of disease. We are looking at a history built on two competing systems, opium and cholera. The popular history often gives you only a vague, hazy picture of the opium trade, smoky dens, distant wars. But here is the quiet, essential truth they often miss. The very foundation of the colonial enterprise in India rested entirely upon the logistics of this single, dark, sticky paste. The real heart of the global opium empire was beating right here in Calcutta, pumping state-sponsored poison through the financial veins of the British Empire. The story of Calcutta is the story of flows. Everything was always moving, always counting, always profiting, always flowing outwards towards the global markets. But the great dangerous contradiction was that the administration only sought to control one kind of flow. The opium flow was visible, mechanical, and predictable. It was a masterpiece of logistical control, a system designed to extract every possible measure of profit. This flow solved the empire's single greatest economic headache, the insatiable Chinese demand for tea. Britain had to pay for its tea in silver, causing a massive, crippling drain on its treasury. Opium was the engineered counterflow, a commodity the British grew in India, forced into China, and sold to correct the empire's financial imbalance. It was the lubricant of empire, meticulously managed from the poppy field to the final auction block. But running parallel to this controlled, magnificent financial engine was the chaotic, invisible, and terrifying system of cholera flow. This system was microscopic, biological, and utterly unpredictable in its human impact. It flowed through the neglected, swampy delta land, through the open drains and the stagnant communal wells. It was a flow of contagion that defied the engineers, the doctors, and the administrators, simply because they chose not to see it, chose not to value its control. These two forces, these two massive historical flows, met right here in Calcutta. The invisible flow of contagion sought out the very paths that the visible flow of commerce had created. The crowded lanes, the dense working quarters, the vulnerable human bodies gathered around the profitable warehouses. The opium trade was an act of aggressive, intentional mastery over the land, the people, and the economy. It demonstrated the heights of logistical sophistication. It brought immense glittering wealth to the European quarter. It was a testament to the belief that money could conquer any obstacle. The cholera epidemic, however, was a profound, quiet rebuke. It demonstrated that no amount of wealth or military power could protect those who willfully ignored the basic, foundational truths of urban living: the necessity of clean water, the dignity of sanitary waste management. The unseen biological flow proved far more potent, far more dangerous, and ultimately far more historically significant than the visible flow of wealth. The money from the opium trade was ephemeral. The necessity of public health, brought to light by cholera, was permanent. Let the rhythmic counting of those opium balls, 1, 2, 3, 4, become the quiet anchor for your focus as we prepare to dive deeper into the precise engineering of that opium wealth in our next section. This engineered flow of wealth gave Calcutta its glittering, visible surface. But beneath the cobblestones, beside the great houses, and especially in the densely packed native neighborhoods, lay a competing, invisible, and utterly chaotic system, a system that defied every attempt at colonial control, the system of sanitation and water. It is here that we find the unseen architecture of cholera. Let us hold this duality, the structured and the chaotic, in our minds as we prepare to observe the meticulous workings of the opium machine.
The opium machine, engineered control. Let us now shift our focus entirely to the controlled system. We are tracing the journey of the opium ball itself, moving from the poppy fields of Bihar, where the latex was harvested with delicate three-bladed knives, to the great government factories. The largest of these, in Patna, was where the raw, sticky material was transformed into the standardized product that would finance the empire. Imagine stepping onto the factory floor. The air is thick, warm, and overwhelmingly sweet. The cloying, heavy aroma of raw opium is everywhere, clinging to the walls, the wooden tables, and the skin of the hundreds of workers. This scent is the smell of immense profit, of distant wars, and of imperial ambition. In these vast, high-ceilinged halls, the process was a quiet, almost ritualistic effort of transformation. The raw opium, a dark paste, had to be carefully graded. Workers, known for their skill and dexterity, sat for hours shaping the paste. It had to be mixed with poppy petals and a small amount of sun-dried tobacco leaf, not to dilute it, but to standardize its consistency for the Chinese market. It was a pharmaceutical process run on an industrial human scale. The most crucial step was the shaping of the balls. Each final ball had to weigh precisely 2 seer, about 4 pounds, and be perfectly spherical. This uniformity was essential. It was a mark of the company's guaranteed quality, an assurance to the wealthy Chinese merchants who would eventually purchase it. The workers would carefully wrap the ball in an outer layer of poppy petals, giving it a dark, smooth, slightly textured surface, like a quiet, dense planet. Now pause and focus on the final act, the stamping. A government official, often a junior clerk, would place the newly formed opium ball into a wooden mold. Then, using a heavy brass seal, a mark bearing the official company crest, he would press it firmly into the pliable paste. This stamp was not just a label, it was the ritual of imperial legitimacy. It was the government's sign that this poison was pure, authenticated, and ready to be sold for a profit that dwarfed any other commodity in the world. The seal affirmed that this was not merely contraband, this was state-sponsored commerce. Once stamped, these thousands upon thousands of balls were dried, packed into thick wooden chests lined with tea leaf dust and began their final river journey down the Hooghly to the great warehouses of Calcutta. The Calcutta warehouses were the final staging ground. Here the temperature was constantly monitored. The quiet tension in these massive stone buildings was palpable. It all led up to the opium auctions. These were not loud, dramatic affairs, but controlled, almost secretive gatherings held in the exchange hall. Wealthy British, Parsi, and Marwari traders would quietly bid on the chests. Millions of pounds would change hands, financing the entire administration of India, all resting on the purity of that dark, stamped ball. This system of control, this engineered flow was impeccable. The opium flow was managed from the soil to the sea, accounted for at every turn. It created the glittering, visible surface of colonial Calcutta. Yet this obsessive control over the purity of the opium paste stood in profound, damning contrast to the complete lack of concern over the purity of the water that the workers drank. The value of the product was measured in gold. The value of the laborers' lives was measured as less than the cost of a simple drain pipe.
The opium machine. Engineered control. Let us now shift our focus entirely to the controlled system. We are tracing the journey of the opium ball itself, moving from the poppy fields of Bihar, where the latex was harvested with delicate three-bladed knives, to the great government factories. The largest of these, in Patna, was where the raw, sticky material was transformed into the standardized product that would finance the empire. Imagine stepping onto the factory floor. The air is thick, warm, and overwhelmingly sweet. The cloying, heavy aroma of raw opium is everywhere, clinging to the walls, the wooden tables, and the skin of the hundreds of workers. This scent is the smell of immense profit, of distant wars, and of imperial ambition. In these vast, high-ceilinged halls, the process was a quiet, almost ritualistic effort of transformation. The raw opium, a dark paste, had to be carefully graded. Workers known for their skill and dexterity sat for hours shaping the paste. It had to be mixed with poppy petals and a small amount of sun-dried tobacco leaf, not to dilute it, but to standardize its consistency for the Chinese market. It was a pharmaceutical process run on an industrial, human scale. The most crucial step was the shaping of the balls. Each final ball had to weigh precisely 2 seer, about 4 pounds, and be perfectly spherical. This uniformity was essential. It was a mark of the company's guaranteed quality, an assurance to the wealthy Chinese merchants who would eventually purchase it. The workers would carefully wrap the ball in an outer layer of poppy petals, giving it a dark, smooth, slightly textured surface, like a quiet, dense planet. Now, pause and focus on the final act, the stamping. A government official, often a junior clerk, would place the newly formed opium ball into a wooden mold. Then, using a heavy brass seal, a mark bearing the official company crest, he would press it firmly into the pliable paste. This stamp was not just a label, it was the ritual of imperial legitimacy.
It was the government's sign that this poison was pure, authenticated, and ready to be sold for a profit that dwarfed any other commodity in the world. The seal affirmed that this was not merely contraband. This was state-sponsored commerce. Once stamped, these thousands upon thousands of balls were dried, packed into thick wooden chests lined with tea leaf dust, and began their final river journey down the Hooghly to the great warehouses of Calcutta. The Calcutta warehouses were the final staging ground. Here, the temperature was constantly monitored. The quiet tension in these massive stone buildings was palpable. It all led up to the opium auctions. These were not loud, dramatic affairs, but controlled, almost secretive gatherings held in the exchange hall. Wealthy British, Parsi, and Marwari traders would quietly bid on the chests. Millions of pounds would change hands, financing the entire administration of India, all resting on the purity of that dark stamped ball. This system of control, this engineered flow was impeccable. The opium flow was managed from the soil to the sea, accounted for at every turn. It created the glittering, visible surface of colonial Calcutta. Yet, this obsessive control over the purity of the opium paste stood in profound, damning contrast to the complete lack of concern over the purity of the water that the workers drank. The value of the product was measured in gold. The value of the laborers' lives was measured as less than the cost of a simple drain pipe.
The flawed foundation, Calcutta's unseen architecture. Let us peel back the glittering surface of the European quarter and focus now on the physical foundation upon which Calcutta was built. To understand the cholera disaster, we must understand the very land. Calcutta was built on the vast, swampy Bengal Delta. It was a city perpetually struggling with water, a humid, low-lying, often sinking landscape where the monsoon rains could turn streets into rivers in an hour. The British decision to build a major port here was a logistical triumph, but an environmental challenge from the start. They had mastered the logistics of global trade, but they failed to master the physics of their own delta home. The lifeblood of the city was the Hooghly River, a massive distributary of the Ganges. The river was a source of spiritual comfort, a critical port for shipping, and fatally, the city's primary sink for raw sewage. To the British administration, the river was primarily a commercial waterway. To the inhabitants, it was life, and the colonial administration allowed it to become death. We return to the concept of the two parallel cities. There was the European quarter, known as the White Town, built on elevated ground, boasting wide paved streets, and crucially possessing an engineered, though rudimentary, drainage system. Here, the wastewater was directed away from the homes, however imperfectly. The merchants and administrators in their grand, pillared marble mansions could enjoy relatively clean water brought in from sources outside the city center or boiled by domestic staff. Their priority was comfort and visible hygiene, protecting the instruments of profit. And then there was the native quarter, the Black Town. Here, the construction was dense, unplanned, and chaotic. Houses were packed together in narrow, unpaved lanes called galeries, which were difficult to clean and perpetually damp. The drainage was largely left to ancient, shallow cuts that choked on refuse and stagnated rapidly in the heat. For water, the native population relied heavily on thousands of excavated ponds and pools, known as tanks. These tanks, originally built for bathing and ceremonial use, quickly became polluted catchments filled with sewage runoff, decaying matter, and surface contamination. These stagnant tanks were the perfect nurseries for contagion. It was into this environment that Dr. James Jameson arrived in 1831, a Scottish doctor coming from the regulated, sanitary world of Edinburgh. His assignment to the dense opium district of Borough Bazaar thrust him immediately into the sensory horror of the Black Town. Jameson was overwhelmed, not just by the sight, but by the pervasive physical assault on the senses. The smell, that thick, cloying mixture of raw opium, human waste, and decaying refuse, was inescapable. He saw the workers packed tightly, sleeping near the very drains that carried the opium dust and the sewage. His noble intentions were met with a reality that defied his medical training. He was trying to treat sickness in an environment that was systematically generating it. The architecture of the city itself was a profound moral statement. The British had engineered health and comfort for themselves, and they had passively, through neglect, engineered sickness and vulnerability for the majority of the population. The flawed foundation of Calcutta was not just a geographic accident, it was a consequence of colonial indifference, a ticking biological clock set by the logic of profit.
The arrival, Vibrio cholerae, and miasma blinders. As we settled into the damp, low-lying landscape of Calcutta, the stage was set for the invisible killer. Now, let us quiet our minds and reflect upon the specific nature of the enemy that arrived, the bacterium Vibrio cholerae. The first great global pandemic of cholera is generally traced back to Bengal, emerging around 1817. From its origins in the Delta, this microscopic enemy utilized the very logistics of the empire to globalize itself. The ships carrying opium, cotton, and tea out of the Hooghly River carried Vibrio cholerae as an unseen passenger, spreading it to distant ports across Asia, Europe, and eventually the Americas. The city that was the center of global wealth became unwittingly the launching pad for global sickness. When cholera struck, its effects were terrifyingly swift and profound. Unlike slow endemic diseases, cholera could claim a victim in a matter of hours. Imagine the onset, a sudden, brutal physiological attack. The first symptom is often a feeling of unease, which rapidly gives way to violent, relentless diarrhea and vomiting. This leads to the terrifying, visible transformation of the victim. The body, unable to retain any fluid, begins to shrink rapidly. The skin turns a mottled blue or gray color, becoming cold and wrinkled. The eyes sink deep into the sockets. This process of profound, brutal dehydration created the distinctive, horrifying marker of the disease, the rice water stool, a pale, cloudy liquid that was an infectious vehicle for the bacterium. This rapid decimation caused utter panic and societal breakdown. No one understood how it moved. The colonial government and most European doctors were tragically blinded by the prevailing scientific belief of the time, the miasma theory. Miasma, they believed, was a poison carried in the air, a kind of noxious vapor that arose from decaying organic matter, sewage, and generalized filth. They believed that this bad air is what caused disease. This belief was logical in a limited sensory way. Areas with bad smells, the stagnant tanks, the crowded opium districts, were indeed where the most sickness occurred. But miasma theory tragically mistook the symptom, the smell of filth, for the cause, the biological agent in the water. This false belief led to decades of futile and expensive remedies. They suggested firing cannons into the air to purify the atmosphere. They advised citizens to carry strong perfumes or to burn spices to mask the bad air. They cleaned the air, but they left the water poisoned. The British administration, clinging to the miasma belief, thus felt morally justified in ignoring the infrastructure. To fix the drains and the water supply would be a monumental, expensive engineering task costing millions. To address the bad air, however, only required superficial efforts and moral pronouncements about the filth of the natives. The irony is immense. The vast logistical genius used to control the opium trade was utterly defeated by a failure to understand basic molecular transmission. They were looking for the enemy in the sky when it was residing quietly in the cup of water. The true tragedy of Calcutta is the history of what could have been prevented if they had simply chosen to look down rather than up and value public health over imperial profit.
Bureaucracy versus contagion, the wall of resistance. By the 1830s, men like Dr. James Jameson began to observe patterns that defied the elegant simplicity of the miasma theory. They noted that the disease didn't randomly strike those living near foul air. It exploded with terrifying focus in areas linked by specific pathways, often the shared sources of water or the routes of funeral processions that used riverbanks. This suggested not a generalized bad air, but a specific, concentrated point of infection. Jameson and his colleagues compiled meticulous reports. These were documents of profound medical urgency, detailing the human cost and the undeniable sanitary disaster of the Black Town. They presented these findings to the Colonial administration, proposing massive, necessary engineering solutions, proper iron piping, deep-cut sewers, and, crucially, the temporary closure of the most contaminated, dense centers of commerce until sanitation could be improved. And here, traveler, we arrive at the cold, quiet wall of bureaucratic resistance. The response to Jameson's scientific observations was not a medical rebuttal, but a financial one. The East India Company officials, the men responsible for the opium flow, received the reports.
They did not debate the nature of the contagion. They debated the cost of compliance. Imagine the scene, a quiet, high-ceilinged room in a government building near the fort. Perhaps only the scratching of a pen on ledger paper breaking the silence. A company administrator looks at Jameson's pleas to shut down the opium storage facilities in Borough Bazaar for cleaning. The official doesn't see human suffering. He sees disruption of yield. The language used was calculated and cold, logistical inconvenience, interruption of revenue, cost of delay to the China shipment. They calculated the daily losses if the opium auctions were postponed or if the processing factories had to stand idle. These losses were measured in thousands of pounds, a figure that dwarfed the entire public health budget for the native population. The refusal was absolute. The opium flow was sacrosanct. The ships were waiting in the harbor to carry the stamped, valuable balls to China. Any interruption would violate contracts and threaten the entire financial structure of the empire. The silent reality was that the lives of the workers, the coolies, the shapers, the cart drivers were already budgeted for. They were disposable. Their cost was minimal. Their replacement rate was tragically high, and their suffering was simply a hidden externality of the balance sheet. The medical arguments about the water were dismissed with the simple, crushing phrase, "out of question." The decision was made. The opium flow would continue. The cholera flow would continue. And the two systems, profit and plague, would continue to reinforce each other in the teeming streets of Borough Bazaar.
The fixer's logic: profit by decimation. As the epidemic intensified, the opium machine began to suffer, not from external moral pressure, but from a purely logistical crisis. The workers were dying faster than they could be replaced. This is where the story introduces a figure who embodies the cruel, systemic logic of the company: Thomas Wickham. Wickham was not a doctor, nor was he a politician. He was, purely and simply, a company fixer, a logistical manager obsessed only with maintaining the flow rate of the product. His mind was a ledger, and his sole moral compass was the balance of profit and loss. When the death rate began to threaten the opium supply, Wickham intervened, not to save lives, but to stabilize the labor cost curve. Let us examine the cold, calculated logic of his response. The traditional supply and demand model suggested that as the pool of skilled opium workers shrank, wages should rise to attract replacements. But Wickham, observing the sheer desperation of the surrounding populace, discovered a horrifying economic anomaly. The cholera epidemic, while terrible, was also creating a constant, fresh supply of desperate, destitute, and uninformed replacements. These new workers, arriving from the countryside, were willing to accept any terms, even the most squalid conditions and the lowest wages, simply for the chance to work. Wickham's insight was monstrously simple and profound. High worker turnover, fueled by the epidemic, was actually beneficial to the company's balance sheet. It prevented the formation of a stable, empowered, well-paid labor force. He systematically reduced wages and eliminated what few safety measures existed, packing even more workers into the same cramped factory and warehouse spaces. He understood that the death of a worker did not mean a cost, it meant a vacancy filled by a cheaper replacement. This was the ultimate dehumanization, the worker reduced to a disposable resource, a variable cost offset by the supply of death. The rhythmic, repetitive work on the factory floor, shaping the paste, stamping the ball, now took place under a cloud of fatalistic resignation. Workers knew their neighbor might be gone by morning, but they also knew a dozen others waited outside for their spot. The company had achieved what Wickham likely saw as the perfect logistical solution, a stable supply of cheap labor, sustained by an unstable, lethal environment. The logic of profit, personified by Thomas Wickham, had successfully weaponized the cholera flow against the very people who were essential to the opium flow. This systemic cruelty, carried out with the quiet detachment of an administrator simply balancing a ledger, highlights the core failure of the colonial project, the absolute prioritization of money over fundamental human dignity.
The Reckoning, Witnesses and the Re-Engineered City. The opium trade continued, immensely profitable, until the political currents of the 19th and 20th centuries finally brought it to its slow, grinding halt. The East India Company itself eventually lost its administrative control, not just due to opium, but because the systemic failures it embodied were too vast and too damaging to ignore. The empire that opium built was ultimately forced to reckon with the invisible killer it had long dismissed. The solution was not military, financial, or spiritual. It was engineering. The slow, quiet, decades-long process of building a modern public health system began. This was a victory of necessity, driven by the quiet power of science and the sheer, unmanageable scale of the suffering. New waterworks were finally constructed, drawing clean water from upstream sources. Thousands of miles of deep-cut sewers were laid, an enormous, expensive undertaking that finally separated the city's sewage from its drinking supply. The cholera flow was at last routed, controlled, and contained. This slow, quiet engineering project, the methodical laying of iron pipes and the sinking of deep-bore wells, was the true infrastructure of liberation. It cost millions of pounds, but it permanently secured the lives of millions of inhabitants. It was a silent admission that Dr. Jameson and the anonymous local medical men had been right all along. And what of the legacy of those who suffered? The quiet victory of public health was built not just on iron pipe, but on the power of the witnesses. The ordinary people in the opium district, the Rajeshes and the Kamalas, who saw the corruption, the indifference, and the cruelty of the system. Their suffering, their lost loved ones, and their determination to document and share the truth became a weight on the conscience of the empire that was heavier than any opium ball. The story of opium and cholera in colonial Calcutta serves as our final quiet lesson. All wealth and power, all grand structures of commerce rest upon the most mundane, foundational systems, the plumbing, the drains, the supply of clean water. The moment the powerful prioritize the visible flow of profit over the invisible health of their people, the foundation becomes rotten. We can take immense comfort in the fact that the truth, once revealed, documented,
and courageously shared, has the power to bring down even the most powerful systems of oppression. The sweet, cloying smell of processed opium has long since faded from Calcutta's air, but the bitter taste of the truth, the knowledge of what happened when a government chose profit over people, it continues to spread, continues to teach, and continues to ensure that we will always look down into the drains before we look up at the glittering mansions. May this history be the quiet foundation for your rest. Good night.